for the magic person to tell me.
Just going to stop sharing because I did realise I forgot to share with sound. So I'll just repeat that little process because there's some sound in a little bit. So I think you can see it again.
Peter started sharing the screen. The recording is in progress. And Peter Cook, we are now entirely in your hands. Bring it home, Peter Cook.
Thank you. And it does feel a bit like the graveyard shift, doesn't it? That at this end of a fairly lengthy and intense conference. So I'm going to hope that you come with me on this little journey, because I guess in essence, that to me is largely what autoethnography is about. And I think of this presentation in a very fond way, and I know there's been some teary moments today and potentially, alert, there might be some more. For me, this presentation is a series of provocations though. It's as a digital dance artist and an educator in that field, I trouble the notion that a digital or a virtual experience is isolating. I also think some people incorrectly think of it as lesser or substandard. And I think the period that we're currently in, I wish we were through, of this pandemic has proven that we can actually still relate and interchange irrespective of any of the conflicting forces. But as a dance artist, ultimately what I want to do is communicate something. I feel like I've got something to say. Probably I feel like I've got something to say all the time, and probably I feel like I've got too much to say most of the time. But I do actually like the fact that movement, which I consider to be my first language, and I'd probably challenge most people to think about what their first language was. And you probably were part of the movement brigade before you were part of the vocalizing in language terms anyway. But I digress. That I love the way that the physicality transposes thoughts and sensations. I like the way it transmits anything abstract to others. And I say this deliberately, and I say it because I do think that I can just enjoy it on my own, but I actually think when I bring somebody else into the experience, it actually furthers the experience. So that's where I sit and that's where I position myself. But ultimately, I hope to offer what I call vehicles of empathy. And I guess that's really where it is that I feel like I meet critical autoethnography. So for me, as I said, it's a transient thing, but I think it's about a series of transient collaborations. So the conference call, which we've heard, talked about and said in so many beautiful ways over these couple of days, it really resonated with me in terms of the way I create and communicate from a creative bubble, and how my creative practice is a series of collaborations. They move in, they move out, but they also move on. And all of them collectively aim to contribute the development of this empathetic experience. So I wanted to just throw a few of my bubbles out there, the bubbles in which I think I exist. And if I think of them at the moment as 5, and they look very isolated in that image, but they're not really existing in that way at all. And if the image was more 3D, I'd have it intertwining, interrelating, and interdispersing at the same times. But for the purpose of the linear flat form of the screens we're looking at, the first one I always think about as me and my own little creative bubble. My ideas, my inspirations, my provocations, they begin somewhere. Rarely do I actually know or acknowledge that they've started, but they do exist in my world, within my own little bubble. And I feel like that's a kind of an important thing, because at some point I respond to why I've actually started to think about this. I think the second important part to me is the creative environment that I live. My environment engages with humans, non-humans, and more than humans, as I employ our bodies, our environments, and our technology to craft, to house, and to communicate meaning. I think we've all become probably a little more aware about our environment, believe it or not, through this period. And certainly that's something that, as I say there, it's actually helped me, believe it or not. I'm trying to find the silver lining in a somewhat dark cloud there. I also have a series of creative partners. They're often different people. They often come into my creative world for a short period of time, go back into their worlds. But the interesting thing, my previous practice before I got into this world was probably dealing with elite dancers and choreographing on extraordinary quality of dancer. And for me, I no longer work in the same geographical space as any dancer I work with. So any of the works that I do, irrespective of how many are involved in this work, they're often in a geographically different space. But I also like the fact that we all enter the same little bubble. So obviously that bubble's quite malleable, yeah? It extends, it goes a lot further than what we probably think. And this is where you lot all come in. Because there's a point about the fact that it is about me and an audience. And at this moment in time, I say it's this audience, yeah? And ultimately, I just want to experience something with you. Not to say that I want you to experience what I want you to experience, but I do want you to arrive at this moment with an experience. And I also have to kind of think all the time, it's very rare for me to know who it is that's ever going to see the work that I create. I say that because it helps with the lack of preempting of what a response is going to be. I don't know who you are. I know some of you, but tonight I don't know who everybody in this room is. So they're my little bubbles, but I pull up a little bit of theoretical positioning here from somebody called Susan Foster, whose fantastic book called Choreographing Empathy, I think intersects so nicely in so much of what we have been talking about here. But she neatly sort of critically reflects on how it is that we respond from viewing and where it is that the output of an artist meets with the input of a responder. And she considers the impact of viewing and responding, and especially in terms of dance. And again, I go back to being my first language, it speaks to me. One of the things that I've really noticed through this conference is there's a heavy amount of, and thankfully so, of poetic inquiry, that the poetry sings throughout so many presentations that we've heard, and I think that's fantastic. And I do think that movement has a similar quality to poetry in that it has a slightly more impressionistic component. It leaves out a few words. It gives you a great idea of what's going on without actually pointing every single thing in your direction. So Foster sort of gets us to think about when it is that we review something and look at something, that you start to question where is it that you go yourself? What do you actually feel? What does this work, whatever the work might be, what does it do for you? And so for me, in reading this work, there's some obvious parts to this. If I've created something, that there's choreography. For me, it often involves some sort of directorial component, so it's quite considered. If it is that there's some sort of music involved, if you listen to the piece of music on its own, that may also have a sensual response. But for me, it's about the composite. It's about pulling all these things together. And as I was sort of talking about earlier, this whole kinesthetic sensation that the choreography puts forward. So what do you actually do when you watch something? Does it challenge you? Does it actually make you feel good? Do you start to move inherently within whatever it is you're currently doing? But there's also this empathetic connection that it proposes to a viewer. So what is it that meaning, how is it actually translating there? Are you all following me so far? So we turn to a little bit of a work. If it's all right, I'd like to share this work with you. And it does some fairly serious nods in the direction of Donna Haraway and work that I probably never really thought I'd understand or appreciate. I'd like to show you a work, if that's all right. It's a work that I've created as a digital dance artist. And I'd like to offer it as a collective moment of empathy. So we are part of this experience. A little bit of background. I created this work out of the loss of a really close friend. Obviously a sad moment for me. And as I often do, I never really probably deal with it that well until I get to create something out of that moment. So what I'm going to ask you to do, or at least invite you to do, is as you have a little look at this, you consider loss. And maybe it's a loss of a loved one, as it was in my case, or maybe it's just the sense of loss that we have been struggling with, I think, especially through this pandemic. But I probably am also thinking about relationships in general, especially with others. And by others, I do mean humans. But I also think about the relationship with the land and how precious the land is, especially as Pam Bernard knows all too well, that the land where I actually live is one of the most beautiful parts of the world, which is where mountains and beaches and seas, etc., all meet. And our coldest day in centigrade is around about the 20 degrees mark, and that's when we put our woolly jumpers on. But I talk about it because I'm in love with the place. I love everything about it. And it seems to also be the place where the nature nurtures. I think it's also the place where I feel, when it is that I get as ensconced as I possibly can, that it actually heals. So I'll ask you, as you watch this piece, it only goes for about 3.5 minutes, that I ask you to really think about where it takes you. I hope it takes you somewhere. And I'm also really hopeful in some ways that even if you don't necessarily want to go there, that this might help you get there. Okay, so popcorn out. Without further ado, I'd like to show you a work called We Are Compost. I did realise partway through that I do hope that we had sound going through all of there. That was why I went back. So there's something about this stuff that makes me linger. As I was saying, this music itself lives as a beautiful piece of music in its own right. I love the way this sort of work helps personally deal with, but I also return back to the old Susan Foster and trying to work out where it is that, if it is that you're feeling something, what it is that makes you feel. And this somewhat becomes a bit of a highlight for me as to what I think Donna Haraway talks about as feeling skin and kin. And that's probably where we most want to be. And for me, it's important that you as an audience is also part of this experience, of that you might carry some part of this with you at some point. And I know that at some point when we get to have a chat, I'd love to hear some of those commentaries from yourself. I think we connect and we become kin despite conflicting forces. And surely this conference itself is an example of that, that if everything can go against it, it does. And yet we still reach out and we seek out wanting to have that sort of connection. I think we also seek to offer empathy and hope it's received and likewise receive it. After all, to me, this is what it's all about. Because I do think we are all compost. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I just encourage people to pop down into that reactions bar and share some reactions. Folks, there's, we'll probably circle back and do some questions after Mark. But Peter, that was just wonderful. Thank you. And that piece, compost is next year in Brisbane. But
yeah.
But thanks for repurposing
something. The juices travel where the juices travel.
Thank you, Peter. Can I just? I haven't seen Ozge join the participant list, but just shout out in case I've missed you. Join us, Ozge. No, okay. Well, Mark Price, I can see you're there and you've unmuted already, ready to go. So, we will hand over to Mark.
Thank you, Craig. And Peter, thank you. I've not met you before, but I feel like I have met you now, and that was just extraordinary. There's I'm really struggling with the online conferences. I've been to several in the last year, and they are great in as much as you make contact and you have that evocative sense of movement and everything, but they are incredibly frustrating as well. And I miss Peter. I miss now going for a coffee with you afterwards to find out more, to hear more about it, and to connect in a way that we can only fragmentally do that in this space. But it's whenever you present, even when we do it in person as well as like this in line, when you write your own piece, when you create your own piece, you know ahead of time you put in an abstract, and by the time the conference comes around, you think, what was I going to do again? And you never quite know where and how your piece is going to be juxtaposed next to others. And it's always extraordinarily surprising, but I shouldn't be surprised, in the way that it resonates. So I'm in the UK. It's incredibly rainy in Brighton today. I'm about a mile from the coast. I joined this morning at 7 o'clock, and Meg, I can see you were here earlier, and I witnessed and was present for your piece. And then Fiona, if any of you caught Fiona's extraordinary piece, earlier as well. But anyway, so I'm going to present something in a second, which is something, a piece that I've been working on my own. I'm here in Brighton. I was a university lecturer for many years in education, and I've recently been through some significant changes. And this piece that I'm going to present is about that piece, about that process. And it relates particularly to this figure, which I'm going to talk about. So I'm just holding it up so you can see how big it is in relation to what I'm going to present, and kind of what it looks like. It's quite heavy. If I was to drop it, it would make a big loud noise. So it's substantial. But I'm going to put it just next to me here, and I'm now going to share the screen if I can. So could I have some thumbs up or just an indication you can see what I'm sharing? Fantastic. Okay.
Yep, we've got your title screen there with the two pictures and your name down the bottom.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Thank you so much. Okay, here it goes. So years ago, I was given a reproduction statuette of Rodin's The Thinker from a cohort of students at the end of their degree, a gift so kindly meant. Or when in deepest lockdown, I left my academic role of over 20 years and cleared my office, The Thinker came home. Over the coming months, I began to cover the statuette with images from magazines I bought and read during lockdown, and added cut-up words later. Over time, the thinker became the dreamer. The autoethnographic product or artifact and the narrating process have become entangled and entwined with rhizomatic methodologies of meaning-making, deconstruction, defamiliarization, and intertextuality. Hence, in reaching for meaning, I aim for and invite a co-constructive ontological dialogue, here, now, in this conference. I work alone, but in relation to others. The narrative presented is sequenced and revisioned from a two-dimensional assemblage of found text to a three-dimensional decoupage. The texts are chosen for association and resonance. This cut-up derivative representation, representation, is one of a personal narrative of identities in processes of becoming. The final piece is seen always as a work in progress, the form lending itself to a non-linearity of reading. And in this flat, two-dimensionally framed presentation, I aim to evoke the liminality between teacher and student, between researcher and writer, between thinker and dreamer, an embodied creative relational repositioning, reselfing, rewilding. A hermit crab has no shell of its own, but rather makes its home in the empty shells of other mollusks. This works fine, marine upcycling, repurposing. But as the hermit crab grows, so it must find a new shell for a new home. Otherwise, the old one will constrict and kill the crab. But in changing shells, the crab exposes itself, unprotected, uncontained. So it is with personal narratives. They offer us protection, but ultimately they restrict us, unless our narrative changes with us. And this then too is a time for exposure, vulnerability, and risk. Philip Sambunda writes, "It is our position that stories are alive and in constant fluidity as we story with them. In research, we see storying as sitting and making emergent meaning with data slowly over time through stories. But my story was dying, fluidity becoming sludgidity. My past had passed me by. You know, bubbles are meant to be temporal. We theorize to give value and meaning to our narratives, but these theorized membranes, so fragile, so uncertain, always so tentative, certainty beyond reach. The thing is, my bubble was becoming vitrified. I could feel it hardening, fragile, fractured. Tammy Spry comments, hope is hard. It can be hard to have. It can be hard to keep alive. Mine was cracking. And so I have to restory through lockdown, through aging, through living, through dying, through changing. My platypus demon, egg-laying, duck-billed, beaver-tailed, otter-footed, taking to the water once more. If only I could swim. The Overstory by Richard Powers left such a lasting mark on me, like a new tattoo. I keep going back to it, marvelling at its richness. Powers writes, I wouldn't need to be so very different for sun to seem about sun, for green to be about green, for joy and boredom and anguish and terror and death to all be themselves beyond the need for any killing clarity. And then this, the growing rings of light and water and stone will take up all of me, be all the words I need. So here, now, I'm looking for, dreaming for, the words I need to grow myself differently. This presentation seeks to span time. It's taken time for me to become. Of course, there is the linear stuff. There are lines and bullet points, images. Maybe you can see my voice. Maybe you can hear my words as I write. You construct your own narrative too. Ever-changing, subtle shifts. Hey, you look different today. Me too. We're never the same. I have history, but who doesn't? Mine wrapped around me. Nothing's new, is it? And so I write myself here and here and here and now again. It's all a bit cut and paste, to be honest. The craft knife, the surgeon's knife, the butcher's knife, they've all had their cut. Can you see the joints? Any resonances, echoes, references? It's all been done before. Of course it has. Any text is a new tissue of past citations, where we layer things over and over. What draws your attention here? Is it the text? His cigarette? Does one obscure the other? And even this presentation is a constructed mosaic of quotations, an absorption, a transformation of another and another. So we live cut up lives, from Burroughs to Bowie, Eliot even, they all had a go. And these 4 pages here, these 4 pages, my CV, this was my life, at least part of it, my academic narrative, 40 years or more, to plunder, to represent, reorder, refashion. It's all still me. Recent study of personalized academic, becoming vulnerable, professional identities frame a narrative, changing careers, a new model of boundary crossing of a shared space, challenging validation, constructing and implications, becoming you between a rock and a hard place, critical debates about personal, social partnerships and relationships, learning collaborative agency and reading and writing, conscientious roles of good son and love less, dreaming congruence and qualitative participatory development. What would my dad think? Let's get changed. Or rather, let's call it a deconstructive phase. Rather than writing as inquiry, this is cut-up inquiry. Could I claim this to be a minor gesture or an ontology of immanence? Who knows? Not me. I never lost control. You're face to face with a man who sold his world. And then again, there are the magazines cluttering up the place, waiting to be recycled. Such disposable representations of self. As the boundaries between a different perspective and a neater edge become increasingly blurred, Psychedelic souls line up an island sanctuary. Whose words are these? Whose narrative? My inner mounting flame, fierce but so fragile. But back then, 18 years ago now, was this how they saw me? A gift so kindly meant. It all had to come back to me. I had no work base anymore, locked out and locked in. The thinker came home. There he sits now, T.S. Eliot, Elizabeth Jennings, and 9 modern poets, my O-level text from 1975, at his shoulder. Everything means something. And look at them all there. Atwood, Cave, Wax, standing over by the record machine, looking like a model on the cover of a magazine. And all through lockdown, it felt like it was just a dream. But I'm waking now, piecing my life together in a different way. From Backton to Bowie to Berry, it's all a cut and shunt job. The rhizomes keep on growing, just narrative threads of becoming and becoming. Dreamer, you know you are a dreamer. I dream of making some kind of sense out of things, but I ebb and flow between all of this, cherry-picking ideas, words and images to make my own. Ivor Goodson spoke to me about narratives being stories of action in theories of context, but I think he got it from Lawrence Stenhouse. You see, nothing's original. And so this presentation is a narrative of my undoing, theorized in the context of becoming a student again, becoming a writer, becoming older, becoming wiser, always fucking becoming. So where do we start? You choose. It's a game, it's playful, remember? I'll tell you what, I'll go first just to give you the general idea, but really, we could start anywhere. I am the dreamer. Your skin, a permanent shadow. The new vegan, stories at the break of dawn. The stillness within autumn retreat. Ridge of myths carved by ice. Great rail journeys, a place to make yourself at home. Once in a lifetime, years recover. Life's too short to ignore your talents. Lockdown rewilding, restorative song, chase the blues away. And first I'm touched, caressed, wounded. Then I try to discover the secret of this touch, to extend it, celebrate it, and transform it into another caress. Growing myself differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was a brilliant way to bring it home for us. Thank you. That was just wonderful. First thing I'll do is just check to make sure that Ozge hasn't joined us. I haven't seen her come up in the participant list. No, I know it's really hard, Mark and Peter, to keep an eye on the chat as you're presenting. So I have a look through the chat. There's some really lovely words there that people have shared. I would like to throw it open to some questions. So we probably have, before we do that, back through the chat, you'll also see, if you haven't caught it today, I did drop in the YouTube link where we'll all head over to in about 25 minutes time. So perhaps that gives us 15 to 20 minutes now of discussion time, and then we'll close this window down. People can head across to the YouTube window for the final keynote. The YouTube link for the final keynote. And we'll open it up to questions. So pop a hand up or call them out. There's not many of us here. We can probably manage a call out.
Hi, I've got one. I've got one. Can I?
There you go. Thank you.
Hi, thank you to Mark and thank you to Peter. Absolutely stunning presentations. There are a lot of themes and threads that you could was connecting with all the time. And I wondered, before I ask a question, what is it that both of you actually saw in each other's presentation that connects where you are in your work, in your presentation to each other? What were those sort of lines of flight that resonated? Just to hear from you both at this point, rather than, hit a question and go crazy. I just want to hear more from you both together, please.
Okay, thanks, Pam, and Peter, I hope it's okay if I go first. Peter's piece for me, I mean, I very briefly, I was a dancer years and years ago. I had one of those like moments where I went to lots of classes at Laban in London and places, and it's a kind of part of my past now, which is so far in the past that it's kind of it's like a dusty book on the shelf. And yet there's something about Peter's piece that kind of just moved me in a way, because it just made me connect back. And there was something about that as well, the film, Peter, the way that you juxtaposed images and the layers of coming in and out. And it felt a very dream-like piece. But at the same time, what I loved about it was it came back to your physical form and your stillness. And that sense of that reconnecting and coming back to ourselves. And I think that theme of coming back to ourselves has been quite strong for me. And it doesn't feel insignificant that this is the last session, I mean, apart from the very closing keynote, that we are a small group gathered together, just regathering ourselves. And I have this strange sense that gradually people will leave this session and there will just be us left right at the very end. So there's something about us returning to compost, which I quite like. But anyway, but thank you. That was my response to Peter's.
It's hard to follow what you've just said, Mark, but there was one of the clips that I know that probably didn't get fully used that I've got sitting in the library, which has got way more stuff than you've just seen, is where there's some nattered grass meeting sand, and the grass itself, if you get too close and you're not aware, as an Australian, we walk barefoot everywhere and we're kind of fine with it, but you get your toes ensconced in this matted grass. And it did happen, obviously. And of course, being a dancer for way too many years, and like you, I'm still a bit dusty on the shelf, Mark. So, but what I was going to say is that you cut yourself, that you inevitably, the grass itself cuts your feet, etc., etc. I've never been so close to understanding rhizomatic analysis as I have at that moment, because I felt like what I had ensconced in my toes was this rhizome, and the fact that I guess that's the part that connected me with what you were talking about, Mark, that there was a sense of unwieldliness and trying to understand it. And I think something I said to somebody just recently was that I think understanding a rhizome is rhizomatic in its own right. But the fact that you're actually trying to articulate that connectivity about identity and all of the things that are thrown in every direction. So I think that was probably the moment. I'm sorry to bring it back to my dirty, cut, bleeding dancer feet and thinking of you, Mark, but that's where it came together. How's that, Pam?
Beautiful, beautiful. And that leads to my question. May I ask the question that leads from that? Thank you, Craig. The changing notions of materiality. You just heard Peter speak about his feet and about the mattering and the matted grass, and the materiality, of the music, which was sort of central throughout. You were sort of sounding your body in resonance, really aligned with the voices. With Mark, you were singing music. You were identifying these key moments, in a really kind of very visceral way. The intimate connection with music and time. and matter. And so I'm coming back to this changing notions and contested practices of materiality in, you know, as artists, as researchers, the materiality of ourselves. Here's the question: what did you learn from preparing for this? You know, what was the insight that you learned from preparing for this presentation? Because something gets distilled, you know, each time we present. What was the sort of zeitgeist for you both? Or maybe there wasn't. But either way, any insights?
I'm happy to jump in first this time, Mark, but I think that, you know, I've been involved in this dance world since I was 6 and I'm now 54, so however many years that equals. And I don't know what I enjoyed about it as a kid, and then as you start to choreograph and you teach and you see a joy, etc., etc. But I think that the thing that really gets to me has been through this pandemic, because a lot of the works that I do are digital. And so therefore they almost don't need on the surface that. I normally, if it's not a work that I'm creating on myself, I'm working with people who I know as dancers, who know me and know expectations and things like that. I also think that the thing, and there was an article I wrote through the pandemic that sat, funnily enough, on the border of Queensland and New South Wales at a place called Point Danger. Again, Pam knows it well. And I was talking about the geographical location, and for some reason I actually had to change locations to write it. And so there I was overlooking the sea, and you know, the weather changes quite dramatically here, as Craig just told me, and can I tell you, it sounds like my roof is about to come off because there's a thunderstorm has literally just erupted. But I'll try and press on. So if you can hear that in the background, it's actually quite ferocious right this second. Again, we're Australians, we're quite used to dealing with the elements, so it's kind of all right. Throw in a few poisonous snakes and we're all happy. But I think that what the materiality bit that you're talking about, I've probably never appreciated as wildly as I feel like I am now, my connectivity with environment. And I don't just mean the environment by walking on it, I mean the environment that we're in now. Because, and I do take your point that you said at the beginning of your presentation, Mark, this isn't maybe ideal for the way we can't go and have a coffee easily, etc., etc. But I still appreciate that it's happening. I still appreciate the moments are happening. And this conference, and especially I saw Mig in here before, and that's the session you were talking about, Mark, was just so raw and beautiful. And the fact that people are brave with their own thoughts and wanting to connect. Apart from that being so, you know, bloody obvious autoethnographically, it's also the fact that we have this willingness to want to learn from each other and be engrossed in each other no matter what. So I think that love of connecting and being one with mine and others' environments is probably the biggest thing for me.
Yeah.
The bit that I suppose that reminds me most of the preparing for this conference and some other conferences that I presented at in the last few months is about the place of being still to begin with, and not rushing. And I think that's something that I've rediscovered more recently. So since the pandemic, I mean, I spent so much time in this same space, in this same chair, in front of the same screen, on Teams and Zoom. But one of the things, particularly during our first lockdown way back, God, it seems such a long time ago now, we were supposedly allowed to go out for an hour each day. And there was a particular area just north of Brighton. And I only about 5 minutes ago realised that my wonderful dear friend, Avril, has joined us. So on the screen, you'll see Avril Lovelace. Avril was my most wonderful doctoral supervisor and just wonderful friend all the way through my doctorate. And one of the things, we would meet together in her office. And there was always a sort of semi-ritualistic element to it, of us coming together. But one of the things we started to do was we would walk together. We would go for a walking supervision. And I suppose one of the things about the lockdown and preparing for this conference and other conferences like this is that place of writing at my desk and rewriting, and if I'm honest, recycling things that I had done before. So although I write anew, everything in a sense is drawn from previous work. So and then moving with it, leaving it behind and walking and thinking. And that process, particularly during lockdown, of writing at my desk and having paper around me, and I write with a pen rather than on a keyboard, and then walking, then moving. And I guess my process, again, acknowledging Avril, of sitting and reading and talking and writing, but then walking, and the movement process, I think is really good. And that's something I've relearned, I think, during lockdown, that walking process, stillness and walking. Dawn, I can see you were waving earlier as well. So
I've got two separate questions. One is a quick one, just now that you've mentioned Avril. Hello, Avril, as well. Did you do your doctorate using autoethnography as your approach, Mark?
Yeah, not originally. I mean, it was narrative was the work. So I was doing long, repeated interviews with people, and as I was doing it, learning that's what I was doing was narrative inquiry. I kind of discovered that as a methodology through Avril and through Ivor, my other supervisor, who I was incredibly fortunate to have. And so I kind of learned about the power of narrative and the process of narrative as a research. And within that, I realized that in order to kind of work within that field, I needed to write my own narrative. So that process of writing, and then that took me, we've got a number of colleagues at Brighton, where I was based before, who were Mike, that were very involved in autoethnographic. Mike Haler, his work was just extraordinary. So that I kind of discovered that. And then more recently still, I've then started to do an MA in creative writing. So hence me being a student again. So that's kind of taken me full circle. Although my daughter did say, "Dad, do you really need another degree?" But of course, yes, the answer is, of course, I do.
So can I move on to the sort of question that I wanted to ask earlier, which is more about sort of seeing you both as something of an inspiration, because what I'm picking up from what you were talking about is that the autoethnographic approach sits very well with this idea of transitions and growth and degeneration. And I think that much later in life, I'm an academic too, I've kind of come back to myself through the aging process, but also through the transitions that I've been living through. So just as a very quick example, I was doing research into walking, but I was doing research into queer Brexit, the impact of Brexit upon us as LGBTIQ plus people. And through that process, all of us who were part of that research team have had our own personal experiences of the thing that we were researching. And we had to take time out because it was just too much for us in terms of our personal lives to do that work in the way that we were doing it. And what I have learned through that process is actually the need to come back to myself, to look at the transition I've gone through, the loss, the grief, the destruction of relationships, the sort of borders, the separation. And for a long time, I thought about returning to that collective research team and trying to pick up the pieces. But in recognizing that we had all been impacted in quite negative ways, and people are not wanting to return to that work because it's just too raw at the moment, that maybe one way to process it was to look in a more sort of autoethnographic way at that experience. And listening to you both speak, I got a very strong sense that your work is also a way of processing your lived experiences. And I just wondered, because I'm new. I'm really new and excited about autoethnography, but I'm kind of scared as well because it feels quite exposing, and it's not, of course, what I'm used to in sort of more traditional ways of doing research, although I'm a social scientist. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about moving maybe from that sort of more traditional approach to research into the autoethnographic world, and how that feels to sort of take that step into this kind of internal world and use this as a research method to process, to learn from, to share with.
I'm quite happy to jump in there. So my PhD is not that long been put to bed, but I didn't use autoethnography. I used artography as a methodology, which is a bit of an interrelation. I'm in arts education by trade, and where artistry and research and teaching, pedagogy, etc., interrelate. So there's that. I've almost had the opposite experience, where I have a day job that's incredibly not artistic, despite the work I probably prefer to do. I've got a fairly heavily admin role within the university I work at, and it's I'm learning to become a more traditional researcher, reluctantly. So can I tell you, I actually deal with, so I've got a whole university role that looks after all students as part of being an associate deputy vice chancellor for students. So through this pandemic, for example, it's dealing with students of hardship, and you know, we had a huge amount of, you know, international students who were stuck here without money and all those sorts of things. Yet the understandings that I think come from working in this way still actually sit in the background of the other work that I do, even though I have to fight that way often, because I think that it's the humanist side that brings ourselves into these sorts of roles. So I do think it's got an element of self, as does artography, can I say? It's artography and autoethnography are very intertwined, but it's got a very strong, you know, self-narrative, self-study involved in this, but it's not autobiographical. It's got to have a meaning beyond me, because who really cares, you know? So it always has this extendable thing, and it always goes then into the community. And so for me, it's also, irrespective of wherever my next role lies, you know, it's got to have that connectivity. And I should have said this when Pam asked the question before about preparing for this. It's not that I've ever got a reluctance to come into this space. It's the space where I probably feel like I thrive, but I've got to keep the mortgage being paid. And, you know, that's where my day job comes into it. And they do collide in lots of different ways. So in very odd ways, but yeah, it is kind of, it's my how can I put it? It's my conspiratorial approach to taking over the world one step at a time through arts-based educational research, and they just don't know it yet, the silly buggers, but one step at a time. So I guess for me, it's all about whatever the research is and whatever the project is that you're working on, and finding the tools that are right at that moment.
Thank you.
I think the thing about transitions, about autoethnographic work being particularly appropriate or helpful or insightful about looking at transitions, I think is really important. And I notice that I write more when I'm in that process of either going into a period of transition, being in it and coming out of it. And of course, I think the lockdown has kind of created that for all of us in some ways. And sorry, forgive me, I can't remember who it was in the chat that talked about decay. And I think the issue about allowing and noticing that things decay is kind of part of that process. Writing, certainly for me, is about bringing consciousness to that process. And actually through writing, it's not just kind of recording the conscious awareness, it's actually creating consciousness. So the writing process then brings into presence and present that consciousness, but also then sharing it. Actually, the wonderful thing, whether it's about supervising students or sharing like this as a conference or writing for a publication, is that you have that interaction, and that through the interaction, it's like, I don't know quite what's going to come out of my mouth particularly when people ask questions, but actually every time we have an interaction like you and I are now, Dawn, it then helps reframe and reposition my thinking, my writing. And so there's a good friend of ours, Jackie, who's just invited me to write a chapter on a book. And I'm going to use this piece as the embryo form for the chapter piece. And it will evolve again because of that. And so that process of sharing, connecting, and reforming and rewriting, I think, is part of the autoethnographic process.
Folks, I'm going to have to do that horrible thing that hosts do from time to time and bring this session to a close because I've just clicked on the YouTube link and it's clicking down. It says that it'll be live in 3 minutes. So I reposted in the chat just a moment ago on the hour, which is coming up about 2 or 3 minutes away. Click on that YouTube link, and then after that, go back to Zoom link 1, and then after that, there's another YouTube link, but I'm sure we'll be able to provide this to you again in the Zoom link. So,
Craig, could you please put it in again? Sorry, I've across.
So just in there, if you click on that link, you'll head across and the clock's ticking down. So I'm going to end this recording and close this meeting. I want to thank Mark, thank Peter, thank Pam and Dawn and everyone for participating. Really great session to finish. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks all. See you soon.